The wind in Pine Hollow had a way of getting under your skin. It wasn't a blustering, angry wind, not yet, but a persistent, searching one that combed through the dying yellow grasses on the hillsides and whispered of the winter to come. It was late autumn in the Wyoming Territory, 1887, a time when the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the sun offered light but little warmth. From the valley floor, the only sign of steady life was the thin, gray ribbon of smoke that climbed from the stone chimney of the Redwater Ranch's cookhouse. That smoke was Lydia Boone's doing. Inside, the world was flour dust and the steady, comforting heat of a cast-iron stove. The wind could pry at the window frames and moan under the eaves, but here, the air smelled of yeast, simmering beef stock, and the faint, sweet scent of browning butter. Lydia stood at a heavy pine table, her back to the door, her world narrowed to the mass of dough beneath her palms. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. The rhythm was as familiar to her as her own breathing, a mindless comfort that had structured her days for the past 7 years. Her hands, chapped and raw in the creases of her knuckles from lye soap and coarse salt, worked the dough with an efficiency that belied her 25 years. They were not pretty hands. They were tools, stained with berry juice in the summer and perpetually dusted with flour in the winter. They knew the precise feel of dough ready for the oven, the heft of a full iron skillet, and the sharp sting of a burn. And as she worked, she hummed. It wasn't a song, not really. It was a wisp of a melody, a simple, nameless tune her mother used to hum while mending shirts by the firelight, back in a life that felt as distant as a star. The notes were soft, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire and the bubbling of the pot. A sound meant only for herself. It was a private thing, a thread of memory woven into the fabric of her solitude. It kept the silence from growing too loud, from filling the corners of the kitchen with the ghosts of unspoken thoughts. The tune rose and fell with the motion of her arms, a quiet counterpoint to the wind's lonely lament outside. She kneaded the memory of her mother's warmth into the dough, the scent of melting butter on the stovetop mingling with the phantom smell of wood smoke and lavender that always accompanied the thought of her. Outside, beyond the reach of the stove's heat, Colt Harrow reined his buckskin to a halt. He hadn't meant to stop. He was just cutting across the ranch's lower pasture on his way back to the small line cabin he used on the North Ridge. A day's hard work mending fences settling into the ache in his shoulders. He was a man who moved with purpose, his life measured in miles of wire checked and cattle counted. He wasn't one for lingering. But the sound, faint as it was, caught him. It drifted from the partially open window of the cookhouse, a sliver of sound carried on the same wind that chilled his neck. It wasn't the boisterous singing of the ranch hands after a payday, nor the formal, strained hymns from the Sunday meeting house in town. This was different. It was low and clear, a thread of pure, simple melody that seemed to be a part of the kitchen itself, as elemental as the smell of baking bread he could just now begin to notice. He sat his horse, perfectly still, his gloved hands resting on the saddle horn. He was a tall man, made taller by the saddle, with shoulders broadened by a life of physical labor. Dust from the trail settled on the brim of his hat and the creases of his worn denim jacket. He didn't lean forward, didn't try to peer into the window. It felt like an intrusion, like looking into a private journal. The sound was not a performance, it was a secret, and the wind had chosen to share it with him. He just listened, his head cocked slightly, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line of the Bighorn Mountains. The melody was a fragile thing, yet it cut through the vast, empty landscape, a small point of warmth in a world growing cold. It spoke of a quiet constancy, of a life lived within 4 walls, of a peace he rarely encountered in his own rambling existence. He stayed until the tune faded, replaced by the clatter of a pan, and the moment was broken. Lydia paused, her hands still in the dough. She lifted her head, a dusting of flour on her cheek. Had she heard something? A shift in the rhythm of the wind, the soft thud of a horse's hoof on damp earth. She glanced toward the window, but saw only the swaying branches of the lone cottonwood tree. For a moment, she thought she'd seen a shadow pass, a shape darker than the gray afternoon. A rider, perhaps, cutting through. It was nothing. Ranch hands passed by all the time. Still, a strange, prickling awareness ran up her spine. She felt as though she had been observed, not with eyes, but with a stillness, an attention that was unusual. Shaking her head lightly, she dismissed the feeling. It was just the wind playing tricks, making the familiar feel strange. She finished her work, shaping the dough into loaves, her movements sure and practiced. She slid the heavy pans into the cavernous oven, the blast of heat a welcome friend against the encroaching chill of the evening. After wiping down the table, her chores for the moment were done. The strange feeling lingered, a quiet hum of curiosity in the back of her mind. On an impulse she couldn't explain. She walked to the heavy plank door and pulled it open. The porch was empty. The wind swept across the worn floorboards, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun was sinking lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. There was no one there. Of course not. She felt a little foolish, but then her eyes caught it. Resting on the top step, just beside the worn spot where countless boots had scuffed the wood, was a small piece of folded brown paper. It was the kind used for wrapping dry goods, creased and rough to the touch. It was held down by a small, smooth river stone, a deliberate weight against the thieving wind. Her heart gave a little thump, a nervous, unfamiliar beat against her ribs. She looked around the empty yard again, scanning the line of trees, the path leading to the bunkhouse, the vast, open expanse of the pasture. Nothing. Hesitantly, she bent down and picked it up. The stone was cool in her palm, but the paper felt strangely significant. Her fingers, clumsy from years of heavy work, fumbled for a moment as she unfolded it. Inside, written in a bold, clean pencil script, were 7 words. Didn't know a stove could hum. That was all. No name, no greeting, no explanation. Just a simple, stark observation. She read the words again, her lips moving silently. Didn't know a stove could hum. It wasn't a compliment, not directly. It wasn't forward or presumptuous. It was a simple statement of surprise, an acknowledgement of the sound she thought was hers alone. He hadn't said he heard her singing. He had credited the stove, the heart of her kitchen, the silent, iron witness to her days. A slow warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign she didn't have a name for it. It wasn't flattery that she felt, but something quieter, deeper. It was the feeling of being heard, truly heard, in her life. Lydia was a function. She was the cook. She provided meals. Men spoke to her to ask for more coffee or to compliment a pie. Women in town spoke of her as the Redwater cook. She was a pair of hands, a provider of sustenance, but this note, this scrap of paper, saw something more. It had listened past the purpose of the kitchen and had heard the private, humming soul within it. She closed the door, the latch clicking softly into place, shutting out the wind. She stood for a long moment in the fading light of the kitchen, the note held carefully in her hand. Who would stop to listen? Who would take the time to write such a thing, and then leave without waiting for thanks or a reaction? It wasn't the way of the ranch hands she knew, men of loud talk and straightforward needs. This was a different kind of gesture. It was quiet, respectful, like the stillness she had sensed earlier. Her gaze fell upon her mother's recipe book, lying on a small shelf near the spice tins. Its leather cover was cracked and peeling, its pages stained with grease and brittle with age. It was her most precious possession, a collection of recipes and faded memories. She carefully opened it to a page for buttermilk biscuits, the corner of which was already torn. She slipped the folded note inside, tucking it deep into the spine, a secret pressed between secrets. It felt safe there, hidden amongst the familiar litanies of flour, sugar, and salt. For the first time in a long time, her heart felt occupied. It had been a space for quiet grief and lonely perseverance. Now, a question had taken up residence there, a small, persistent query that buzzed with a life of its own. It wasn't just the identity of the writer that puzzled her. but the nature of his hearing. Who was the man who had stood silently in the wind, listening? And when he heard that simple, half-forgotten tune, what had he heard besides just a song? What echo of memory? What whisper of loneliness? What small note of hope had the wind carried from her kitchen to him as the fire in the stove settled into a low, steady glow? Lydia realized the silence in the kitchen no longer felt empty. It felt like a held breath, waiting for an answer. The day after she found the note, the world felt different, not in a grand, earth-shaking way, but in the small, quiet corners of Lydia's awareness. When she stepped out onto the porch in the pre-dawn chill, a familiar, damp air greeting her, her eyes immediately fell on the woodpile, or rather, where the woodpile used to be a haphazard stack of logs she'd thrown together in a hurry. Now, it was a perfectly ordered wall of split pine and cottonwood, each piece aligned with the next, forming a structure so neat it seemed a shame to dismantle it. A fresh pile stood beside it, wood that hadn't been there when she'd locked the door last night. It was still damp, carrying the clean, sharp scent of the creek that ran through the lower pasture. The cuts were even, made by a strong arm and a sharp axe. Whoever had done this had worked in the dark, silently. She ran a hand over the rough bark of a pine log. It was a simple, practical thing, a supply of fuel for her stove, but it felt like more. It felt like a continuation of the conversation started on that scrap of paper. The first pile said, "I see your work is hard." This new one added, "Let me make it easier." She carried an armload inside, the fresh scent of the wood filling the kitchen as she fed the logs into the stove's firebox. The flames caught quickly, licking at the dry kindling before embracing the new wood with a hungry roar. The kitchen began its slow awakening. Later that morning, as she reached into the tall pantry cabinet for a sack of cornmeal, her hand paused on the iron latch. Every day for as long as she could remember. Opening this door was a two-part chorus, the click of the latch and the loud, protesting squeal of the top hinge. It was a sound so ingrained in her routine that she no longer truly heard it, any more than she heard the ticking of the old clock. But this morning, there was only the click. The heavy door swung open in an unnatural, unnerving silence. She stopped, her hand still on the latch, and pushed the door back and forth. Smooth, silent. She peered closer at the hinge. The old rust and grime had been wiped away, and a faint, dark gleam of fresh oil coated the pin. The screws, which she knew had been loose and wobbly, were now tightened flush against the wood. Her gaze dropped to the floor, searching for a stray drop of oil, a footprint, any sign of entry. There was nothing. The door had been locked. He must have done it from the outside, she reasoned, reaching around the door frame with a steady, patient hand to do the work while she slept. The silence of the hinge was louder than its previous squeak had ever been. It spoke of an attention to detail that was almost startling. It was one thing to notice a humming tune from a distance, another to notice a faulty hinge that only the person using it every day would be bothered by. He wasn't just observing her, he was observing her world, the small frictions and annoyances of her labor. He was listening not just with his ears, but with his eyes. Throughout the day, she discovered other small changes. The wooden bench just outside the kitchen door, where she sometimes sat to shell peas or catch a breath of air, had always been a trial. It was old, weathered by years of sun and snow. The wood had warped, creating a dip in the middle where rainwater pooled, and the surface was a minefield of splinters. She'd learned to sit on it carefully. But now, it was transformed. The warped surface had been sanded down, the wood grain smooth and pale under her tentative touch. It was still old, still bearing the scars of its long life. But the roughness was gone. The legs, which had wobbled precariously, were now firm. She could see the heads of new, neatly hammered nails securing the joints. Someone had taken the time to dismantle it, sand it, and put it back together, stronger than it was before. She sat down, the surface solid and welcoming beneath her. From here, she could see the vast expanse of the valley, the distant mountains a soft purple against the horizon. It was a place of rest, made whole again. Lydia now understood. The stranger, this ghost who left firewood and fixed benches, did not speak with words. He spoke with his hands. His language was effort, his vocabulary made of neatly stacked logs, oiled hinges, and sanded wood. These were not grand gestures designed to win favor or demand a response. They were quiet acts of service, offered without expectation of thanks. They were gifts of anonymity, which made them all the more profound. A man who wanted praise would have knocked on her door and presented his work. This man simply saw a need and filled it, as quietly as the sun rising. She found herself humming more often, but the nature of it had changed. Before, it had been an unconscious comfort, a private melody for an audience of one. Now, it felt like a signal. She kept the tune low, softer than before, letting it thread through the kitchen air like a question she didn't dare speak aloud. "Are you there? Are you listening?" It was a tentative offering, a way of acknowledging his presence without breaking the silent spell that had fallen over her small domain. She was calling to him, not with a name, but with the very sound that had first drawn him in. A few days later, she saw him. It was mid-afternoon, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. A loud clatter on the roof of the cookhouse made her jump. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a sudden, sharp anticipation. A few loose shingles, casualties of the autumn wind, slid down the pitched roof and tumbled to the ground. Then, a pair of worn leather boots appeared over the edge, followed by the man they belonged to. He moved with a quiet confidence, his balance sure on the steep incline. He was tall, with the wide shoulders and lean frame of a man who spent his life in the saddle. He wore a faded blue shirt and dusty denim trousers, his hat pulled low, shadowing his face. It was Colt Harrow. She knew of him. Of course, he was one of the contract riders who worked the North Range, a man known for his skill with horses and his preference for his own company. He rarely came down to the main ranch buildings, and she'd only ever seen him from a distance. He set to work immediately, pulling new shingles from a pouch at his belt and tapping them into place with a small hammer. The sounds were rhythmic and efficient, the scrape of the old shingle being removed, the sharp, precise taps of the hammer driving in the nails. He didn't look down, didn't seem to notice she was standing in the doorway below, watching him. Lydia stayed where she was, half hidden by the doorframe, her dishcloth clutched in her hand. This was him, the man who listened from the wind, the man who spoke with an axe and a hammer. He wasn't a ghost after all, but a man of flesh and blood, doing a simple, necessary job. When he finished the last shingle, he gathered his tools and turned. For a single, breathless moment, his eyes met hers. His gaze was steady, calm, and startlingly direct. There was no artifice in it, no boldness, just a simple, quiet acknowledgement. His eyes were the color of the prairie grass in the dry season, a deep hazel that seemed to hold the light. He gave a single, small nod. It wasn't a greeting so much as a confirmation. Yes, it was me. Then he turned and disappeared over the peak of the roof. A moment later, she heard the soft thud of his boots hitting the ground on the other side of the building, followed by the sound of his footsteps receding. He hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. The nod had been enough. The next morning, nestled on the top step where the folded note had been, sat a single flower. It was a wild daisy, its white petals a stark, perfect circle around a bright yellow center. A drop of morning dew still clung to one of the petals, sparkling like a tiny jewel in the early light. Lydia bent down and picked it up, her rough fingers gentle on its delicate stem. This was different from the firewood and the repairs. This was not an act of practical necessity. A daisy could not warm a room or fix a squeaky door. It served no purpose other than to be itself, to be a small, unassuming spot of beauty. And she knew this flower. It didn't grow in the lower pastures or along the creek bed. These particular daisies, with their strong stems and vibrant centers, grew only on the high western slope of the far ridge, a place you had to ride to deliberately. He had gone out of his way. He had ridden to the ridge, dismounted, and chosen this one flower. He had carried it all the way back, protected in his hand, and left it for her to find. This was the most eloquent sentence he had spoken yet. Lydia brought the flower inside, into the warm, fragrant air of her kitchen. She looked for a place to put it, a vase or a jar, but she had none. Her world was made of iron, wood, and tin, objects of utility. Then her eyes landed on the small, stoneware salt cellar that sat beside the stove. It was plain and sturdy, a vessel for preservation. Carefully, she filled it with water and placed the daisy's stem inside. The single white flower stood on the shelf, a silent, luminous witness to her work. It was a secret, a splash of color in her monochrome world, a piece of the high, lonely ridges brought down into the heart of her kitchen. She had her firewood, her silent hinge, her sturdy bench, and now she had a wild daisy in a salt cellar. It was a secret she shared with a man she'd never spoken to, a bond forged in silence and held together by the quiet language of things that were mended, things that were offered, and things that were beautiful. The kitchen no longer felt like just her own. It held the echo of his presence, the evidence of his care. As she began to mix the day's bread, she started to hum, her tune a little stronger now, a little more certain. The silence they shared was a fragile, beautiful thing, a shelter built for two. But outside the kitchen door, the world of the ranch was waking up, and in a world of loud voices and easy gossip, she couldn't help but wonder, could a thing built of silence ever be strong enough to withstand the noise of other people's words? The sound was almost too soft to be real. A gentle crunching on the gravel path just outside the kitchen door, as distinct from the heavy, hurried bootfalls of the ranch hands as a whisper is from a shout. Lydia didn't turn. Her hands, dusted with flour, were still on the warm, yielding surface of a finished pie crust. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the motes of flour dancing in the air, turning them into a golden haze. The kitchen was quiet, save for the low, contented crackle of the fire in the stove and the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece, a rhythm she had lived by for years. But this new sound, this quiet arrival, had introduced a different rhythm, a pause in the beat of her own heart. She knew it was him. In the days since she had first seen him on the roof, a silent awareness had grown between them, a language spoken in deeds, not words. The neatly stacked wood, the smooth bench, the wild daisy that still stood, its petals now curling slightly, in the salt cellar by the stove. Each was a sentence, a paragraph in a story she was only just beginning to learn how to read. He would come and go like a shadow, leaving these quiet testaments to his presence. And she, in turn, would hum her simple tune, a reply she hoped the wind would carry. Today. However, the silence felt different. It felt expectant. He was not leaving. He was waiting. The soft crunching had stopped. She could feel his stillness on the other side of the door. A weight in the air. Her own breath hitched. To speak would be to break the spell, to turn their silent understanding into something spoken, something real and perhaps fragile. But to remain silent felt like a betrayal of the courage he had shown in his quiet acts. Her voice, when it came, was little more than a whisper, directed at the wall of pots and pans in front of her. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. "You don't have to leave something every time." The words hung in the warm, yeasty air, small and uncertain. She immediately wished she could take them back. They sounded ungrateful, like a dismissal. She had meant them to sound like a release, an assurance that she required nothing from him, that his quiet attention was enough. A long moment passed, filled only by the ticking of the clock. She thought perhaps he had gone, that her clumsy words had chased him away. Then a voice answered from the doorway, and it was nothing like she had imagined. It was a low, calm baritone, a voice that sounded as if it were accustomed to the vast, open spaces of the prairie, unhurried and clear. It held no artifice, no bravado. It was simply true. I only do it when I find a silence worth keeping." The words settled over her like a warm blanket. He understood. He had not seen her as a woman in need of fixing or charity. He had seen the quiet world she had built for herself in this kitchen and had sought only to reinforce its walls, to mend its small fractures, to protect its peace. Slowly, as if pulled by an invisible string, she turned. And there he was. Colt Harrow stood just inside the threshold, framed by the fading light. The sun at his back obscured his features for a second, turning him into a broad-shouldered silhouette. Then he took a step forward, into the soft glow of the kitchen, and she could see him clearly for the first time. He was, as his actions had suggested, solid, grounded, not handsome in the polished way of the men who came to the main house for dinner with the ranch owner, but carved from a different, more durable material. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with fine lines etched around his eyes. Those eyes, a deep hazel, regarded her with a calm, steady gaze. It was a look that didn't pry or possess, it simply saw. A fine layer of trail dust coated his worn denim jacket and the brim of his hat, which he now held in his hands. Turning it slowly by the brim, he looked as though he belonged to the hills and the sky, and that standing under a roof was a temporary condition. He let his gaze drift around the kitchen, taking in the copper pots gleaming on their hooks, the string of dried herbs hanging from a beam, the small daisy in its unlikely vase. His eyes didn't linger on the worn floorboards or the patched-up plaster, but on the signs of life, of care. "You don't just cook," he said, his voice still low, but filling the small space. He looked back at her, his expression serious. "You keep something warm in this kitchen." A flush crept up Lydia's neck. For years, she had been the cook, an extension of the stove itself, a pair of hands that produced meals. Her identity was her function. Men praised her biscuits, her stews, her pies. They praised the product of her labor. No one had ever praised the spirit behind it. No one had ever suggested that what she did was more than simply combining ingredients. He saw not just the bread, but the warmth. He heard not just the song, but the silence it was born from. A lifetime of habit told her to look down, to study the floorboards, to make herself small. It was what she always did when faced with direct attention. But she didn't. His quiet respect was a mirror, and in it, for the first time, she saw herself not as a servant, but as a keeper of a flame. She stood a little straighter, her hands resting on the flour-dusted table, a surface that was as much a part of her as her own skin. She was rooted here, in the familiar, comforting scent of cooling bread and simmering stock, and it gave her an unexpected strength. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them until only the heavy pine table separated them. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and drew something out. He placed it gently on the table, in a clear space between a bowl of apples and her rolling pin. It was a book, a small journal, bound in dark, worn leather. The cover was softened with age and use, the corners rounded. A simple leather thong was wrapped around it to keep it closed. It was an intensely personal object, something that had clearly traveled many miles in a pocket close to its owner. He didn't speak. He just looked from the book to her, his eyes inviting her to understand. Hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers, calloused and chapped, brushed against the smooth, supple leather. It was warm, in the cool air of the approaching evening. The leather held a distinct, living warmth, as if it still carried the heat from his body. She unwound the thong, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She opened the cover. The pages were pristine, page after page of clean, unblemished, cream-colored paper. There wasn't a single mark, not a smudge, not a word. It was a book full of emptiness, full of silence, full of potential. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "If there's ever a day you want to write words for the song," Colt said, his voice softer now, almost gentle, "this paper will listen first." He held her gaze for another moment, a long, silent exchange that said more than an hour of conversation ever could. It was an offering of a voice. a space for the thoughts she had only ever hummed. He was giving her a place to put the words she didn't know she had. Then, with a final, small nod, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. His footsteps on the gravel were as quiet as they had been when he arrived, and then they were gone, swallowed by the vast silence of the coming night. Lydia was left alone, standing in the deepening shadows, the kitchen lit only by the soft orange glow from the stove's grate. The air still seemed to hold the shape of his presence, the scent of dust and the open range. Her hand rested on the open journal. The smooth, blank pages seemed to have a light of their own. It was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. This gift was not firewood or a flower. It was a challenge. It was an invitation to look inward, to find the words for the nameless melodies that had filled her lonely hours. The blank paper was a question, asking who she was beyond the flower and the fire. To write in it would be to claim a part of herself she had kept hidden even from herself. It was an act of immense courage. The empty page called to her, offering to hold her secret hopes, her quiet sorrows, her unformed dreams. But in return for that solace, what fears would she have to confront first? What ghosts would she have to name before she could set them down in ink? The weight of the book in her hands felt heavier than any iron skillet, heavier than a whole winter's supply of wood. It was the weight of a voice, waiting to be born. The change was subtle at first, a shift in the air of the kitchen as definite as a drop in temperature before a storm. The familiar, comfortable silence that had once been Lydia's companion was gone. In its place, a new kind of quiet had taken root, a tense, watchful silence, punctuated by whispers that stopped the moment she drew near. The other kitchen hands, two women from town named Molly and Clara, moved around her with a new, guarded energy. Their chatter, once about the price of flour or a sick child, now seemed to circle a topic they would not name in her presence. But she felt it in their sideways glances, in the way their conversation would halt abruptly when she entered the pantry. The kitchen, her sanctuary, had been breached. It was no longer a space of solitude and warmth. It was a room full of eyes. Molly, a woman with a perpetually pinched face and hands that were always wiping themselves on a dirty apron, was the boldest. She watched Lydia with an undisguised, sour curiosity. She saw the new, smooth bench by the door. She saw the neatly stacked firewood that seemed to replenish itself. She saw the single, wilting daisy in the salt cellar, and her thin lips tightened into a line of disapproval. To Molly, these were not quiet kindnesses. They were transactions. The whispers finally found a voice one afternoon while Lydia was peeling a mountain of potatoes for the evening meal. The rhythmic scrape of her peeler was the only sound for a long moment. Then, Molly slammed a heavy bowl of washed carrots onto the table next to her, splashing water onto Lydia's apron. "Some people have all the luck," Molly said, not looking at Lydia but at Clara, who was kneading dough across the room. The comment was a stone tossed into a still pond. "Hum a few notes, and you can pull the lone wolf right down from his hill." Clara gave a short, nervous laugh and bent lower over her dough, refusing to be drawn in, but the words were out. They hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Hum a few notes. The phrase cheapened the one private, joyful thing Lydia possessed, turning it into a lure, a calculated trick. Lydia's hand stilled, the peeler frozen mid-stroke. The potato felt cold and heavy in her palm. She did not look up. She did not say a word. Molly, emboldened by the lack of a challenge, smirked. She pushed a cast-iron pot across the table with a loud screech. A cowboy gets bored easy, though, and a kitchen fire always burns out. The meaning was clear, layered with a venom that stung more than any open insult. It wasn't just about her and Colt. It was about her station, her place. A reminder that she was the cook, that her fire was temporary, and that a man like Colt Harrow, a man of the open range, would never be tied to something as mundane as a stove. Lydia said nothing. She resumed her work, but the rhythm was gone. Her movements became mechanical, her hands clumsy on the familiar task. The thread of her humming, the quiet melody that had been the soundtrack to her days, was severed. A knot formed in her throat where the music used to be. The kitchen felt airless, suffocating. Her hands, which had always moved with such certainty, now felt slow and heavy, as if she were working underwater. The story, however, was not contained by the kitchen walls. Like a grass fire, it caught the wind and spread. In the bunkhouse, the hands embellished the tale with every telling. The quiet acts of mending and stacking wood were twisted into a bold courtship. The single daisy became a bouquet. Lydia's quiet humming was transformed into a siren song, deliberately performed for an audience of one. From the bunkhouse, it was a short ride into town. In the dim, smoky light of the saloon, the story grew taller still. Men who barely knew Colt Harrow's name now spoke of him with authority. "Heard Harrow's finally been roped. By the Redwater cook, she's a quiet one. The quiet ones are always aiming the highest." The whispers became a narrative, a crude drama for public consumption. Someone added a new, cruel detail. "She's not just aiming for the cowboy. She's got her eye on a spot in the main house." The cook was getting ambitious, they said, using the lonely rider to leverage a better position. The story was no longer about a simple, silent connection. It was a sordid tale of social climbing and manipulation. Colt heard the talk. He couldn't avoid it. A man who values silence learns to read the noise around him. He heard the sudden hush when he entered the stables. He saw the smirks exchanged over the tops of whiskey glasses when he stopped in town for supplies. He caught snippets on the wind, fragments of the ugly story they had built. The cook, aiming high, Harrow. His reaction was to retreat deeper into his own silence. He spoke even less than usual. His face, already a mask of stoic calm, became unreadable stone. When a ranch hand tried to make a sly joke about the cook's singing, Colt simply gave him a long, flat look until the man stammered an apology and backed away. He didn't deny the rumors. He didn't engage with them. He simply raised his fences higher. Silence had always been his shield, his territory. Now, it became his fortress. He kept to the high ridges, mending fences that didn't need mending, his work a deliberate act of isolation. He believed his quiet dignity was the only honorable defense. He didn't realize that from Lydia's perspective, his silence looked like distance. It looked like abandonment. Back in the kitchen, the world had shrunk. The joy Lydia had found in her work curdled into a chore. The warmth of the stove no longer felt comforting. It felt like a cage. The sounds of the kitchen, the bubbling pots, the sizzle of the skillet seemed to mock her silence. She stopped leaving the window open during her midday break. The small ritual of letting in the fresh air, of listening to the world outside, was over. The closed window was a statement. The kitchen was sealed off, its secrets locked inside. But instead of feeling safe, it felt cold. The air grew stale, heavy with the scent of old grease and unspoken resentment. On the shelf by the stove, the wild daisy died. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The vibrant yellow center faded to a dusty brown. The white petals, once so crisp and perfect, curled inward, turning brittle and translucent. The stem drooped, and the whole flower seemed to shrink in on itself, a gesture of defeat. It sat in the salt cellar, a dried, skeletal memory of what it had been. Its life had been sustained by water, but it was surrounded by a substance meant for preserving what was already dead. The symbol of a living, growing thing had become a monument to something lost. Its fading color mirrored the faith draining from Lydia's own heart. The entire valley seemed to have caught the scent of the story. It wasn't just Molly's sneers or the saloon gossip. It was in the way the ranch owner's wife now looked through her. Her requests for meals clipped and impersonal. It was in the way the delivery boy from town no longer met her eyes, just setting the supplies on the porch and leaving without a word. A verdict had been passed, a judgment made by a jury of whispers. She was the conniving cook, and he was the foolish cowboy she had trapped. The simple beauty of what had passed between them had been trampled into mud. Lydia stood alone in her cold kitchen, the silence a deafening roar in her ears. She looked at her hands, then at the closed window, and finally at the leather-bound journal Colt had given her. It sat on the shelf, untouched. its blank pages a silent accusation. He had given her a place to find her voice, but the voices of others had stolen it before she could even write the first word. She was trapped. Her silence, once a source of peace, was now seen as proof of her guilt. To speak out, to defend herself, felt impossible. What could she say? How could she explain a connection that had existed without words? But to remain silent was to let them win, to let them bury her under the weight of their ugly story. She could retreat further, lock the door, and let the fire in the stove and in her heart burn out completely. Or she could do the one thing that now terrified her most. She could sing again, not the quiet, unconscious humming of before, but a song sung deliberately, a sound thrown into the teeth of the wind, an act not of hope, but of survival. The question hung in the stale air: would Lydia choose the silence that was her prison? Or would she find the one note that could set her free? The cold came before the light. Lydia felt it seeping through the chinks in the cookhouse walls, a damp, penetrating chill that the banked embers in the stove could not hold back. She rose in the familiar darkness, her movements automatic, and was pulling on her shawl when she saw him. A figure, dark and still, standing by the hitching post behind the kitchen. For a heart-stopping moment, fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her weary resignation. But the set of the shoulders was familiar, as was the patient stillness. It was Colt. His horse stood beside him, saddled and ready, its breath pluming in the gray, uncertain air. He had not come to her door. He had waited at the back, in the space that was hers, away from the watching eyes of the main house and the bunkhouse. As she slowly opened the door, the cold air rushing in to greet her, he turned his head. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, impossible to read. "Come for a ride with me." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an order. It was a simple statement of intent, spoken in his low, calm voice that seemed to absorb the tension from the air. She hesitated, her hand clutching the rough wood of the doorframe. The kitchen behind her, which had been her prison for days, suddenly felt like the only safe place in the world. To go with him was to step out into the open, into the landscape of the rumors that had been built around them. His long silence in the face of the gossip had felt like a withdrawal, a confirmation of her unworthiness. Why was he here now? She looked at his face, trying to find an answer in the shadows. She found nothing but a quiet, waiting resolve. Then she thought of the cold, silent kitchen, of Molly's sneering face, of the dead Daisy in the salt cellar. The silence in here had become an enemy. The silence out there, with him, was at least an unknown. Without a word, she pulled the door shut behind her, the shawl tight around her shoulders, and walked towards him. He helped her onto the second horse he had brought, a gentle mare whose saddle was worn and comfortable. His touch was brief and impersonal on her elbow, a simple, practical act of assistance. They set off without another word, leaving the sleeping ranch behind them. The path he chose was not the main track that led to the pastures or the town road. It was a narrow trail, little more than a whisper of flattened grass that wound its way up into the foothills. It was a path made by deer and wandering cattle, a route known only to those who spent their time alone in the high country. It was too narrow to ride side by side, so she followed the straight, broad line of his back, the rhythmic sway of the horse a comforting, hypnotic motion. As they climbed, the world changed. They left the damp, low-lying air of the valley floor and rose into a thinner, sharper atmosphere that smelled of pine needles and cold stone. The sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the crow of a rooster faded away, replaced by the creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of hooves on the trail, and the immense, sighing voice of the wind as it moved through the pines. Lydia felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen with every foot they gained in elevation. Up here, the air was clean. It didn't feel thick with unspoken words and judgments. It was just air. She watched Colt's back. He rode with an easy, unconscious grace, a man perfectly at home in this rugged, lonely landscape. He was a part of it, as much as the weathered rocks and the stunted, wind-scoured trees. She understood now why he had retreated here. This was his sanctuary, his fortress of silence. He hadn't abandoned her. He had retreated to the only place he knew how to be himself. And now, he was bringing her into it. After what felt like an hour, the trail opened onto a high, windswept ridge. It was the spine of the hills, the place where the earth met the sky. Colt dismounted and walked to the edge, his boots silent on the carpet of pine needles. Lydia slid down from her mare, her legs unsteady after the long climb, and joined him. The view stole the breath from her lungs. Below them, the entire Redwater Valley was laid out like a map. The ranch, which had been the whole of her world, the center of her universe of work and worry, was just a small cluster of toy buildings, a puff of smoke rising from a chimney that had to be her own. The vast pastures were patches of brown and gold, and the fences, the endless lines of wire that defined every man's property and purpose, looked like nothing more than thin pencil lines drawn delicately across the land, their rigid authority softened by distance. From up here, everything that had felt so large and oppressive seemed small, insignificant. Colt stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the scene below. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat and flattened his jacket against his back. It was a living presence, a third person standing with them on the ridge, its voice the only sound. "A man like me is born with his name tied to a certain number of acres," he said, his voice quiet, almost carried away by the wind. He wasn't looking at her, but at the sprawling, fenced-in land below. "People in the valley. They know my name. They know my father's name. And they know the lines on the map that belong to us. It's a kind of fate." He gave a short, dry laugh that held no humor. "You spend your life walking the fences someone else built for you." He was giving her his own story, his own cage. He wasn't the free, untamed rider of the rumors. He was a man bound by legacy and land, his silence a product of a life spent within carefully drawn lines. Lydia pulled her shawl tighter, the wind whipping a strand of hair across her face. She thought of her own inheritance, so different from his. "I was born with the smell of ash," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, fortified by the clean, cold air, and a pair of hands nobody thinks to call by name. He turned his head then and looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a deep, profound understanding. He saw her. He saw the anonymity of her labor, the way she was defined not by a name or a piece of land, but by her function, by the fire she tended and the meals she served. They were from different worlds, a man of property and a woman of service, yet they were both fenced in, both defined by the roles the world had assigned them. The wind swirled around them, a silent witness to their shared confession. It seemed to gather their words and hold them for a moment before scattering them across the vast, empty sky. In its impartial embrace, their two lonely truths met and acknowledged each other. Colt reached into the pocket of his jacket, the same pocket that had once held the journal. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't the rough, brown wrapping paper of his first note, but a piece of clean, white ledger paper. He unfolded it and held it out to her. It was a piece of staff paper for writing music, but it was not printed. It had been drawn by hand. The 5 parallel lines were wobbly, traced with a pencil and a not quite straight edge. The clef at the beginning was a clumsy, hesitant imitation of the real thing. It was a flawed, imperfect, beautiful thing. It was the work of a man who had seen a need and had done his best to fill it with the tools he had. Lydia stared at it, her throat tight. She reached out and took the paper from him. It was stiff and cool in her hands. She traced one of the unsteady lines with her finger. "When you write the words," Colt said, his voice low and steady against the wind, "and you find the notes to go with them, I'll build a frame for it." She looked up at him, her eyes blurring. "I'll hang it on the wall," he finished, his gaze unwavering, "so that kitchen will know the name of its own song." He wasn't asking her to sing for him. He wasn't asking her to prove the gossips wrong. He was telling her to give a name to the soul of the place she inhabited, to claim her voice not for the world, but for the very walls that had been her prison. He was offering not just to listen, but to build a place of honor for what he heard. A single tear escaped her eye, and the wind whisked it away before it could fall. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, clutching the hand-drawn staff paper as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The ride down the mountain was as silent as the ride up, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a space of uncertainty, but a vessel filled with a shared, unspoken promise. As they descended back into the valley, the fences grew harder, the buildings larger, the world of whispers and judgments more real, but it no longer seemed as frightening. Perspective, once gained, was a hard thing to lose. Lydia held the paper tucked safely inside her shawl. It was just a piece of paper with some wobbly lines, a silent and unwritten song, but she couldn't help but wonder, as they rode back towards the smoke rising from her chimney, if a thing as fragile as a piece of music could ever be strong enough to build a roof over two lonely hearts. The town's autumn market was a noisy, cheerful beast, faded canvas bunting, bearing the sun-bleached colors of a dozen forgotten celebrations, flapped between the storefronts. The air, thick with the fine Wyoming dust kicked up by a river of people, was a confusing but pleasant mix of scents: the sweet, dark smell of hot molasses from a candy-maker's stall, the sharp tang of cinnamon from fresh pies, and the earthy, ever-present odors of horses and dry hay. A lone fiddler sawed away at a lively tune near the livery, his music a bright, frantic thread weaving through the low hum of 100 conversations, the laughter of children, and the calls of a man selling patent medicine. For Lydia, it was not a celebration, it was a battlefield. She carried a wide wooden tray laden with the peach tarts the ranch owner's wife had insisted on entering into the town baking competition. The tray was heavy, its edges digging into her palms. Its weight was more than just sugar and pastry. It was the weight of her obligation, the burden of being visible in a place where she desperately wanted to be invisible. Her plan was simple: navigate the crowded Main Street, deliver the tarts to the judging table set up outside the mercantile, and retreat back to the anonymity of the ranch as quickly as humanly possible. Every step was a trial. The crowd, a chaotic swirl of dusty boots and calico dresses, seemed to part for everyone but her. She felt eyes on her, glances that lingered a moment too long. Was that a whisper she heard as she passed the blacksmith shop? Did those two women by the dry goods store fall silent and turn their heads as she approached? Paranoia was a bitter taste in her mouth. The open, cheerful space of the market felt more confining than the four walls of her kitchen. Here, there were no walls to hide behind. She kept her gaze fixed on the plank boardwalk in front of her, counting the steps, focusing on the simple mechanics of walking and balancing the tray. The fiddler's tune seemed to mock her, its joyful energy a stark contrast to the cold knot of anxiety in her stomach. She reached the long table draped in a white cloth where the baked goods were being displayed. Her goal was in sight. Just a few more feet. Well, if it isn't the singing cook. The voice was like honey laced with ground glass. It was sweet, melodious, and perfectly pitched to cut through the surrounding noise. The fiddle music seemed to falter for a beat. Lydia froze, her back to the speaker. She knew that voice. It belonged to Clara Vance, the daughter of a neighboring landowner, a young woman who moved through the world as if she owned it, her confidence a weapon she wielded with casual precision. Slowly, Lydia turned. Clara stood there, a picture of effortless superiority. Her dress was a deep blue silk that shimmered in the autumn sun, and her hands were encased in delicate white lace gloves. Even her leather boots, peeking from beneath her hem, were polished to a high sheen. She was everything Lydia was not: clean, soft, and utterly at ease with being the center of attention. A small group of her friends, similarly dressed, flanked her like ladies-in-waiting. The crowd, which had been a formless, moving river, began to change. People slowed their pace. Conversations nearest to them died down. Heads turned. A space began to clear around them, an invisible circle being drawn on the dusty street. It was as if a silent signal had been given, and an audience was now assembling for a play they had all been waiting to see. The fiddler, sensing a shift in the mood, let his tune trail off into a single, screeching note of the bow dragging across the strings. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. An invisible rope had been thrown, and it was tightening around Lydia's chest. Clara took a delicate step forward, her eyes sweeping over Lydia's plain, flour-dusted apron with a look of mild amusement. "We've all heard so much about you lately," she continued, her smile never reaching her eyes. "It's quite the story. The lonely cowboy on the hill, charmed by a simple kitchen song." Lydia's hands tightened on the wooden tray, her knuckles turning white. She could feel the heat of dozens of eyes on her. She felt stripped bare, her private, fragile connection to Colt pinned like a butterfly to a board for public display. She said nothing. Her throat was a desert. Clara's smile widened. Sensing her victory, she let her gaze drift towards the distant hills, the direction of Colt's work, before bringing it back to settle on Lydia with chilling precision. "But you must know how these things are, dear," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of mock sympathy that was crueler than any shout. A cowboy might stop at a kitchen for a moment's warmth. It's a convenient, rustic sort of comfort. She paused, letting the words sink in, letting the crowd absorb their meaning. But a landed man, a man of property, he knows to come to the main house for his supper. The words were a blade, expertly slid between Lydia's ribs. They drew a sharp, brutal line between the two of them, between the temporary comfort of a kitchen and the permanent status of a main house, between a passing fancy and a suitable match. It was a public declaration of Lydia's place, and a dismissal of any hope she might have had to rise above it. A ripple of quiet, appreciative laughter went through Clara's friends. The crowd just watched, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Lydia felt something inside her begin to tremble, a deep, resonant tremor of humiliation and rage. For a moment, she wanted to hurl the tray of tarts at Clara's perfect, smiling face. She wanted to scream, but she knew that any outburst would only prove their point, casting her as the hysterical, grasping cook they already believed her to be. Her only defense was the same silence that had once been her comfort. She had to get away. Holding on to the last shred of her dignity, she gave Clara a single, brief look not of defiance, but of dismissal, and turned her back. She began to walk away from the table, away from the circle, still clutching the tray of tarts. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping her back straight, on holding the note inside her from breaking into 1,000 shattered pieces. Then, a new sound sliced through the suffocating silence. It was the hard, staccato rhythm of a fast-moving horse on the packed earth street, a sound of urgency and power that made people start and turn. A dark bay horse, flecked with foam, parted the crowd as if it were water, its rider pulling it to a sharp, sliding halt right in the center of the circle Clara had created. It was Colt. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid, angry grace. He was covered in the dust of the high country, his face grim, his hat pulled low. He didn't look at Lydia. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes, and they were not the calm, quiet eyes she had seen on the ridge, but chips of granite, hard and cold with a fire banked deep inside, were fixed on one person, Clara Vance. The air crackled. This was a confrontation the crowd had not expected, and they held their collective breath. Colt walked forward, the sound of his spurs a soft, metallic threat. He stopped directly in front of Clara, so close that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. The confidence on her face wavered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It was low, and it carried with absolute clarity in the sudden stillness. "There's two kinds of people in this world, Miss Vance," he said. He paused, and for a brief, searing moment, his eyes left Clara and found Lydia where she stood frozen. A few yards away, his gaze was a lifeline, a silent acknowledgement, a promise. Then his eyes snapped back to Clara, hard as tempered steel. "There's the kind that know how to keep others warm," he continued, his voice level and cutting. "And then there's the kind that only know how to keep the eyes of a crowd." Clara's face paled. The smile was gone, replaced by a tight, brittle mask. "I'll take warmth over a spectacle any day," Colt finished. He didn't need to say another word. The sentence, delivered with the force of a physical blow, hung in the air. The invisible rope that had bound Lydia was cut. The power dynamic of the entire scene had been irrevocably shattered. Colt had not defended himself or Lydia against the rumors. He had simply stated a truth, a choice, and in doing so, had exposed Clara's cruelty for what it was, a desperate, empty performance. Without another glance at her, he turned and walked to Lydia. He gently took the heavy tray from her numb fingers. His hand brushed hers, and the warmth of it was a jolt back to life. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod, an instruction to follow, and together, they walked away, leaving Clara Vance standing alone and exposed in the center of a silent, watching crowd. The story had been about them. Now, it was about her. They walked through the market, the crowd parting before them now with a new kind of respect and a healthy dose of fear. The whispers that followed them were of a different sort entirely. A single sentence, spoken in the middle of the market, had not killed the rumors. A flood is not stopped by a single stone, but it had changed the course of the river. It had drawn a new line in the dust, and now, no one was quite sure which side they were supposed to be standing on. The wind was not a whisper that night. It was a fist. It came down from the high, dark ridges of the Bighorns, a solid wall of cold, hard air that slammed into the Redwater Ranch with the force of a physical blow. The old cottonwood trees groaned, their branches clawing at the sky. Dust and stray leaves flew in horizontal streaks, and the whole world seemed to shrink under the relentless, shrieking assault. Inside the cookhouse, Lydia felt the attack in the very bones of the building. The windows rattled in their frames, and a low, mournful howl came from under the eaves. The stove, usually a source of steady, comforting heat, seemed to struggle against the onslaught. A draft, cold and sharp, snaked across the floor, chilling her ankles. She had just finished cleaning up after the evening meal, the kitchen set right for the morning, and was about to retreat to her small adjoining room. Then, it happened. A sudden, violent downdraft punched down the stone chimney. It was not a gentle puff of air, but a hard, angry shove. The stove gave a guttural cough, a belch of thick, black smoke that billowed out from the grate and into the room. The smell was instant and acrid, not the familiar scent of burning pine, but the bitter, choking odor of soot and creosote. Lydia jumped back, her hand flying to her mouth. She coughed, her eyes already beginning to sting. She moved quickly towards the window over the sink, intending to pry it open, to let the foul air out and the clean, cold wind in. But before she could reach it, a particularly vicious gust hit the side of the building with a sound like a freight train. The loose-sashed window, already rattling, was slammed shut with a deafening crack. The latch, old and rusted, fell into place. The room was plunged into near total darkness, the only light coming from the angry red glow of the stove's grate. As Lydia's eyes struggled to adjust, she saw a tiny, terrible star fall. A single, glowing ember, dislodged by the backdraft, tumbled from the grate. It traced a brief, parabolic arc through the smoky air and landed with a soft, almost silent hiss on a small pile of dry cleaning rags she'd left on the hearth. For a single, suspended heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a thin, pale tendril of a different kind of smoke began to rise. It was not the black, sooty smoke from the chimney, but a grayish-white wisp that carried the sharp, sickeningly sweet smell of burning cotton. A tiny orange line appeared at the center of the rag, and then, with a soft whoosh, it blossomed into a small, hungry flame. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She lunged for the water bucket by the door, but she was already disoriented. The smoke was thickening with terrifying speed, no longer just a cloud but a physical presence. It was like wet wool, heavy and suffocating, filling her mouth and nose, stealing the air from her lungs. She began to cough, deep, racking coughs that bent her double and left her gasping. Her eyes were streaming, useless. The familiar landscape of her kitchen had vanished, replaced by a swirling, blinding darkness. She stumbled, her hip catching the corner of the big work table. A stack of tin plates clattered to the floor. She ignored them, her only thought the door. The door was the way out. She found it with her hands, her palms slapping against the rough, reassuring wood. Her fingers fumbled for the iron latch. It was heavy, cold. She lifted. It didn't move. Stuck. The wood of the doorframe must have swollen in the dampness of the last few days. She threw her weight against it, her shoulder slamming into the planks. It didn't budge. The smoke was a monster now, a living thing that was crawling down her throat, burning its way into her lungs. Her head felt light, the room tilting sickeningly. Her hands, scrabbling at the immovable latch, felt clumsy, disconnected from her body. Her knees gave way, and she slid down the door to the floorboards. The air was slightly clearer down here, but it was still poison. Each breath was a new torment, a razor blade of soot and heat. The howling of the wind outside the walls became a scream inside her own head. She was trapped. Darkness was closing in, a thick, final curtain. Her last conscious thought was of a single wild daisy, standing in a salt cellar. Outside, walking the line of the horse paddock, Colt heard the wind. He was restless, unable to settle. The scene at the market had changed something, brought their quiet understanding out into the harsh, ugly light of day. And he felt a protective instinct so fierce it was a physical ache in his chest. He was just turning to head back to his small cabin when a sound, sharp and out of place, cut through the wind's steady roar. It was the unmistakable clatter of falling metal, a pan, a stack of plates. It came from the cookhouse. It was a sound of accident, of distress. He didn't think, he ran. He covered the 50 yards in a dead sprint, the wind tearing at him, trying to hold him back. As he got closer, he saw it. A thin, unnatural flicker of orange light against the dark windowpane of the kitchen, and he could smell it. The scent of a fire that was not contained, not in a stove, but running wild. He hit the door with his shoulder without breaking stride. The impact was a solid, jarring thud that vibrated up his arm and into his teeth. The old wood groaned but held. He could hear the latch rattling uselessly on the other side. He didn't shout her name. There was no air for shouting. There was only action. He drew back a step and threw himself at it again, aiming for the spot right beside the latch. This time, the wood screamed. There was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, as the latch tore free from the splintering frame. The door flew inward, and the kitchen exhaled. A solid, roiling wall of black smoke poured out of the doorway like a released beast, thick and foul, momentarily blinding him. He dropped instantly, instinct taking over. He knew fire, smoke rises, the good air is low. He crawled into the mouth of hell, the smoke a thick, oily blanket above him. The heat was intense, a physical presence that seared his lungs. "Lydia," he yelled, his voice a raw bark. No answer, just the roar of the wind and the hungry crackle of the flames, which were now greedily consuming the pile of rags and beginning to lick at the leg of the wooden table. He moved forward on his hands and knees, sweeping his arm in front of him. The darkness was absolute. He couldn't see. He could only feel. He crawled towards the stove, towards the heart of the kitchen. He was searching for a different kind of heat, not the sharp, angry heat of the fire, but the fading warmth of a living body. His hand brushed against wool, a shawl, then an arm. She was limp, a dead weight on the floor. There was no time for gentleness. He hooked his arms under her, getting a firm grip, and surged to his feet, hauling her up into his arms. He held her tight against his chest, her head lolling against his shoulder, and turned, stumbling back towards the square of gray night that was the open door. As he plunged through the doorway and out into the screaming wind, he felt a sudden, sharp sting on his back. A spark from her smoldering apron, fanned by the sudden rush of air, had leaped to his own shirt. The wind, which had been the cause of the disaster, now became its accomplice, whipping the tiny ember into a small, bright flame that began to eat its way across the dry cotton of his shirt. right between his shoulder blades. He didn't stop. He kept moving, half running, half stumbling across the yard, away from the burning kitchen. Lydia was a leaden weight in his arms, her life a fragile thing he held against his own body. The fire on his back grew, a patch of searing, intense pain. He could feel the heat through the layers of his clothes, the sting of it on his skin. He reached the horse trough, 100 feet from the kitchen, and finally allowed himself to stop. He gently laid Lydia down on a patch of damp, cold grass, far from the danger. Then, still on his knees beside her, he reached behind him, his hands slapping clumsily at the fire on his back. He beat at the flames with his bare palms, the smell of burnt cloth mingling with the horrifying, sickening smell of his own seared flesh. He gritted his teeth, a low groan escaping his lips as he slapped again and again until the last stubborn spark was extinguished. He slumped forward, his body trembling with adrenaline and pain, his hands raw. He looked down at Lydia. Her face was pale in the moonlight, smudged with soot, but she was breathing. A shallow, ragged breath, but it was there. He had pulled her from the fire. He had saved her life. They were no longer two people who had found a quiet understanding across a silent distance. They were something else now. A man who had walked through a fire, and a woman who owed him her every breath. The debt was absolute, forged in smoke and paid for with flesh. The only question left, as he knelt beside her in the howling Wyoming wind, was whether a bond created in such violence could ever find its way back to the quiet language where it had begun. The first thing she knew was the smell, not the acrid, choking scent of smoke and ash, but the clean, sharp fragrance of pine, warm and soothing. The second was the weight. A heavy, soft wool blanket was tucked securely around her, a comforting pressure against her chest. The third was the silence. The howling of the wind was gone, replaced by a deep, profound quiet. Lydia's eyes fluttered open. The light was pale, hazy, and unfamiliar. She wasn't in her small room off the kitchen. She was in the main house, lying on a long horsehair sofa in the formal parlor, a room she had only ever entered to dust. A low fire crackled in the grand stone fireplace, its warmth the source of the pine scent. Her throat felt like it had been scoured with sand, and a deep, aching soreness radiated from her lungs with every shallow breath she took. Then she saw him, and the world came into focus. Colt was sitting on the floor beside the sofa, not in a chair, but on the rug, his back resting against the heavy velvet of the couch. He was slumped forward slightly, his head bowed, asleep in a posture of utter exhaustion. His face was smudged with soot, his hair matted. His eyes, even when closed, looked raw and puffy. One of his hands was resting on the floor, palm up. The other was holding hers. His grip was not tight or possessive, but a simple, steady contact. His fingers were wrapped loosely around hers, his thumb resting on her knuckles. It was clear he had been holding her hand for a very long time. As her eyes adjusted further, she saw that his knuckles were raw, the skin scraped away, and dark blisters were beginning to form on his palm. The image of him beating at the flames on his own back flashed through her mind. A terrifying, dreamlike memory. He had carried her out, and he had been burned. She tried to squeeze his hand, a small, grateful pressure, but the movement, slight as it was enough to wake him. His head jerked up, and his eyes, bloodshot and rimmed with the red of smoke and sleeplessness, focused on her. For a moment, there was only a raw, unguarded relief in them, a look so profound it made her heart ache. He didn't ask if she was all right. He could see that she was breathing, that she was awake. He simply tightened his grip on her hand, a silent confirmation of her presence. She tried to speak, to form the words "thank you," but all that came out was a dry, rasping croak. A fit of coughing seized her, a painful, tearing sensation deep in her chest. Colt was on his feet in an instant, pouring a glass of water from a pitcher on a nearby table and helping her sit up, his arm a solid, steady presence behind her back. She drank greedily, the cool water a balm on her raw throat. She leaned back against the cushions, exhausted by the small effort. The silence settled between them again, no longer the tense, watchful silence of the kitchen, but a quiet space filled with the enormity of what had happened. He sat back down on the floor, not in the same exhausted slump, but sitting straighter now, his eyes fixed on her face. "The kitchen," she finally managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Is it?" "It's gone," he said, his own voice raspy from the smoke. The roof fell in just before dawn. A wave of desolation washed over her. Her home, her sanctuary, her prison, it was all gone. A place of so much silent joy and so much public pain, reduced to a pile of wet ash and charred timber. Colt seemed to read the loss in her eyes. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense, his blistered hand still holding hers. "If the kitchen was your song, Lydia," he said, his voice low and rough with a conviction that cut through the quiet room, "then I'll build the walls and the roof for it." It wasn't a promise of romance. It wasn't a flowery declaration. It was a statement of fact, as solid and practical as a foundation stone. He was not offering to save her. He was offering to build with her. He would not let her song be silenced by the ashes. As the sun rose higher, the news of the fire, which had traveled on the wind the night before, began its second journey on the tongues of men, but this time, the story was different. The whispers that had once been filled with malice and speculation were now hushed with awe and a grudging respect. The narrative had been burned clean, leaving only the hard, undeniable facts. The cookhouse had caught fire, the quiet cook had been trapped inside, and the lone rider from the North Ridge, Colt Harrow, had run into the flames, broken down the door and carried her out, getting burned himself in the process. It was a story of fire and courage, a tale that resonated with the harsh realities of life in the West. It was simple, elemental, and true, and against its stark power, the flimsy, spiteful edifice of the old gossip collapsed into dust. The valley had a new story to tell about them. The change was not spoken. It was shown, in a series of small, quiet gestures that began to arrive at the main house like a slow, turning tide. First came the young stable boy, a lad of no more than 15, who appeared at the back door with an armload of perfectly split, dry pine. He laid it carefully on the porch, not the green, unseasoned wood usually left for the house, but the best from his private stash. He didn't say who it was for. He just nodded awkwardly at the housecook and fled back to the safety of his stables. Next came a surprise. The wife of the saloon owner, a stern, hard-faced woman named Martha, arrived in her buggy. She handed a jar of her prize-winning strawberry preserves to the ranch owner's wife, with a small handwritten note tied to it with a piece of twine. The note had only 4 words for a strong heart. Then came the most profound apology Lydia would ever receive. She had been moved to a small guest room and was looking out the window. When she saw Molly was not in the main house kitchen, where the extra work had been moved. She was outside, by the horse trough, beside a blackened, sorry-looking pile of pots and pans that had been salvaged from the fire. With her sleeves rolled up to her elbows and her face set in a grim line, Molly was scrubbing the heavy, soot-blackened cast-iron skillets. It was brutal, thankless work. She scoured and scrubbed, her arms moving with a fierce, punishing rhythm, washing away not just the soot, but her own unspoken shame. She never looked up at the house. She never said a word. But the loud, scraping sound of her work was the clearest apology Lydia had ever heard. Late in the afternoon, 3 men arrived in a wagon. They were the carpenters from town. They didn't come to the main house to ask for instructions. They walked directly to the smoking ruins of the cookhouse, their tools in their hands. Without a word, they began to measure the foundation, to pull away the charred timbers, to assess the damage. No one had hired them. No one had asked them to come, and no one dared to ask them what their price was. That evening, Colt came to her room. His hand was bandaged now, and he looked tired, but the exhaustion in his eyes had been replaced by a focused, steady light. He carried a piece of smooth, planed board. On it, sketched in charcoal, was a simple drawing. It was a building, small, sturdy, with a low, welcoming porch and a wide stone chimney. It had a large window that faced the east, to catch the morning sun. It was a kitchen. At the top of the drawing, in Colt's bold, clear script, were 3 words, "The humming stove." He held it out for her to see. "It won't just be a ranch cookhouse," he said, his voice quiet. "We'll build it close to the main road, for travelers, drovers, anyone with a hungry belly and a tired heart." He tapped a finger on the name he had written. "A place for anyone who needs a meal, or a song to warm them up." Lydia looked from the simple, hopeful drawing to his earnest, smoke-stained face. The fire had taken everything from her home, her security, the small world she had known. But in the ashes, something new was being built. A structure made not just of wood and stone, but of a community's penance and a quiet man's unwavering resolve. The kitchen he had drawn was more than a place to sell food. It was a place to offer refuge. It was a place to prove that a kindness, offered in silence, could ultimately be heard above the loudest, cruelest noise. It would be a place, she realized, to finally redeem a silence that had been so terribly misunderstood. The new kitchen rose from the ashes not as a replica of the old, but as its testament. The work was swift and purposeful, fueled by a collective, unspoken need to mend what had been broken. The carpenters, who had asked for no payment, worked from dawn until dusk. Colt was there beside them, his bandaged hand a stark reminder of the fire's cost, his healthy one hammering nails with a steady, relentless rhythm. He did not direct, he labored, his silence a more potent force than any foreman's shout. The result was a building that felt both new and ancient. The roof was higher, with a steeper pitch designed to shed the heavy winter snows and defy the wind's downdrafts. The main window, a wide pane of precious glass that must have cost a fortune, was set to face east, a deliberate invitation for the morning sun to be its first guest. Inside, the great stone stove was the heart of the room, built with a deep firebox and a wide, flat top. Its stones fitted so perfectly they seemed to have grown that way. The shelves, sanded down from thick planks of pine, were smooth as polished bone under Lydia's tentative touch. Every joint was tight, every surface level. It was a kitchen built not just to function, but to endure. It was a fortress made of care. On the day before they opened, Colt hung the sign. He had carved it himself in the evenings, by lantern light. The letters were deep and clean, cut into a thick slab of weathered cottonwood. It read simply, "The Humming Stove," and underneath, in smaller, more elegant script, were the words, "Where a hum warms the belly." He hung it over the new, sturdy door, and the kitchen, at last, had its name. The opening morning was a spectacle of quiet redemption. The first to arrive were the ranch hands, not in their dusty work clothes, but in clean shirts, their hats held respectfully in their hands. They filed in, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a subdued deference, and sat at the new wooden tables, their gazes taking in the bright, clean space. They were followed by travelers, drawn by the sight of a new building and the thin, promising curl of smoke from the chimney. Soon, the room was full, a mix of familiar faces from the ranch and the curious, weathered faces of strangers passing through. The air filled with the rich, savory smell of beef and barley stew, a deep and honest fragrance that spoke of long, slow simmering. It mingled with the sweet, crumbly scent of fresh-baked cornbread, golden and warm from the oven. The sounds were not of gossip, but of life, the clink of spoons against thick pottery bowls, the low murmur of conversations, the scrape of a bench as someone made room for a newcomer. Lydia moved through it all in a state of focused grace. This was a different kind of work. She was not a hidden servant in a back building. She was the heart of a public hearth. People looked at her, not with the sharp, judging eyes of the market, but with a simple, open gratitude. They met her gaze and nodded their thanks. The food she served was more than sustenance. It was an offering of peace, and they received it as such. Every morning, just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge and poured its golden light through the wide window, Lydia performed a small, private ritual. She would walk a short way from the door to a patch of wild daisies that had sprung up, and she would pick a single, perfect one, She would place it in a small glass jar, no longer a salt cellar, that sat on the windowsill right beside the door. It was a silent, daily thank you, a renewal of a promise, a quiet acknowledgement of the first gift that had started it all. It was a piece of the high ridge brought down to the valley, a secret language that only 2 people in the world understood. One evening, long after the last customer had gone and the kitchen was quiet, Lydia sat at one of the tables. The air was cool, smelling of soap and damp wood from her cleaning. The only light came from a single oil lamp that cast a warm, golden circle on the table. She pulled out the leather-bound journal Colt had given her, its blank pages still a terrifying, beautiful promise, and beside it, she placed the piece of hand-drawn staff paper, its wobbly lines a map to a country she had not yet dared to explore. For a long time, she just looked at it. The song was in her, a melody that had lived in her throat for years, but the words were buried deep. To write them down was to give them weight, to make them real. It was to claim a voice the world had told her she did not possess. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pencil. She touched its sharpened point to the paper, right below the clumsy, hand-drawn clef. The first word was the hardest. But then she thought of the wind on the high ridge, a wind that had not judged or whispered, but had simply listened. She thought of the fire, and the man who had walked through it. She thought of the daisy on the windowsill, and the words began to come. She wrote a title first, her script hesitant but clear, Wind Over the Roof. Then, the lyrics flowed, a simple, quiet story of a song that was lost and then found, of a silence that was broken not by a shout, but by a steady, listening heart. Their days fell into a rhythm that was as natural and unspoken as the changing of the seasons. Colt was there before she was, waking in the deep, star-filled darkness. The first sound of the new day was the clean, sharp crack of his axe splitting firewood. He would have the stove lit and a kettle on to boil by the time she arrived, the fire a low, steady pulse of warmth to greet her. While she mixed her doughs and started her stews, he would wipe down the tables, sweep the floor, his movements efficient and quiet. They worked around each other in a seamless, silent ballet. When she reached for a heavy sack of flour, his hand would already be there to lift it for her. When she turned from the stove with a heavy, sizzling skillet, he would be there to clear a space on the table. They passed bowls and utensils, refilled water buckets, and stacked firewood, their bodies moving in a synchronized orbit, a conversation held in motion. They rarely spoke, because they didn't need to. Every shared task, every anticipated need, was a sentence. Every moment of shared labor was a paragraph in a story they were building together. One morning, an old planter from a neighboring valley, a man known for his sharp eyes and sharper tongue, stopped in for an early meal. He sat at a corner table, drinking his coffee, and watched them. He saw the way Lydia passed a heavy bowl of potatoes to Colt without looking, her hand extending to a place where she simply knew his would be. He saw the way Colt, in turn, placed a clean towel beside her, just before she needed it to wipe her hands. It was a dance of perfect, unconscious partnership. The planter shook his head slowly, a look of wonder on his weathered face. "This place," he said, his voice a low rumble, to no one in particular. "It feels more like a chapel than an eatery." Colt, who was polishing a stack of tin cups, didn't look up from his work. His voice, when he replied, was quiet but carried with absolute clarity in the still morning air. "She's the one who makes it sacred." He kept his eyes on his task, but the words were a vow. They were his testimony, a public declaration of her worth, offered not with grand gestures but with the simple, unadorned truth. He had built the walls and the roof, but he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the stone of the stove, that she was the one who had brought the light in. Lydia, who had overheard from across the room, felt the words settle deep inside her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. She looked around the bright, bustling kitchen, at the faces of the strangers and neighbors finding comfort within its walls. They had built a home, a sanctuary, for a whole community of lonely and hungry souls. The kitchen had become a house for everyone else. And in the quiet space between a shared glance and a helping hand, she felt the slow, steady construction of a home that was just for them, a place where their own hearts, finally, could come to rest. A year turned. The seasons wheeled across the Wyoming sky, and the humming stove became as much a feature of the landscape as the winding creek and the old cottonwood trees. It was more than a place to eat. It was a place to rest a weary soul. The building, born from ash and community, seemed to possess a quiet gravity that pulled people in. Drovers, their faces maps of dust and distance, would stop for a bowl of stew and leave a piece of their loneliness behind. Ranchers' wives, their hands chapped from lie and labor, would come for a slice of pie and end up sharing stories of sick children and failing crops, their words finding a safe harbor in the warm, fragrant air. The kitchen didn't just absorb these stories, it transformed them. The clatter of cutlery, the low murmur of conversation, and the steady, rhythmic sounds of Lydia's work became a kind of music that healed the broken edges of the tales it gathered. The humming stove did not sell food, it served communion. It dealt in warmth, and its currency was kindness. One late autumn afternoon, with the wind carrying the first sharp bite of the coming winter, the mail rider stopped by. He usually just waved as he passed, but today he dismounted and handed Lydia a single, thin envelope. It wasn't a bill for supplies or a letter from a vendor. The envelope was addressed simply to the Singing Cook, Redwater Valley. The handwriting was a childish, looping scrawl. Later that evening, after the last customer had gone and Colt was outside banking the fire for the night, Lydia sat down at the table she and Colt had built together. She opened the letter. The paper inside was smudged with what looked like tear stains, and the pencil had been pressed so hard it had nearly torn through. It was from a young girl named Annie, who lived in a small settlement downriver. She wrote that her mother had passed by the humming stove on a trip to town and had come home telling stories about the wonderful food and the cook who sometimes hummed a tune while she worked. "My mama said your humming was like a prayer," the letter read. "I like to sing, too. I sing to the cows when I bring them in. But the other children, they laugh at me. They say I sound like a sick calf. My PA tells me to be quiet, that it's unseemly for a girl to be making noise. Is it worth it? Ma'am, is it worth singing if nobody likes the sound?" Lydia read the letter 3 times. The childish, desperate question, "Is it worth it?" echoed in the silent kitchen. It was the same question she had asked herself in the cold, hostile silence after the rumors began. It was the question the blank pages of her journal had taunted her with. That night, long after the rest of the ranch was asleep, Lydia sat at the table with the oil lamp casting a solitary golden circle of light. She took out a clean sheet of paper, the same kind she used for her supply lists, and dipped a pen in a small bottle of ink. She thought for a long time, the only sound the soft hiss of the lamp and the low, steady breathing of the dying embers in the stove. She didn't write a long, preachy letter full of advice. She wrote from the heart of her own hard-won truth. "Dear Annie," she wrote, "your mother was right. A song can be a prayer. Sometimes. It's the only one we have. Don't sing for the other children. Don't even sing for your PA. Sing for the cows. Sing for the creek. Sing true to your own heart and let the wind be your first listener. It never laughs, and it carries a tune farther than any voice ever could." She folded the letter and paused. On the shelf, beside the door, was a row of small jars, each holding a dried daisy from a summer day. She took one, its petals as delicate and brittle as a butterfly's wing, and slipped it inside the envelope with her letter. The next morning, when she handed the letter to the mail rider, it felt warm in her hand. It smelled faintly, she knew, of flower and pine, and the faint, sweet dust of a wild daisy. A few days later, Colt brought in the frame. He had worked on it for weeks, in stolen moments at the end of long days. It was made of dark, weathered pine, the corners joined with a skill that spoke of patience and a deep respect for the wood. It was simple, unadorned, and perfect. Without a word, he walked to the wall beside the great stone stove. the warmest spot in the kitchen. He hung the frame on a nail he had placed there when they built the wall. Inside the frame was the first song she had written, on the piece of staff paper he had drawn for her, "Wind over the roof." The paper was yellowed now, and a faint, brownish stain marked one corner where a splash of hot stew had once landed. It was not a pristine document. It was an artifact of their life, a testament to a voice that had found its words. It hung there now, a permanent part of the kitchen, its silent music a foundation for every meal that would ever be cooked there. The afternoon was quiet. The midday rush was over, the tables wiped clean, the floor swept. A soft, hazy light filled the room. Lydia stood at the long work table, her hands moving through a mountain of dough for the next day's bread. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. The rhythm was as familiar as her own heartbeat. And as she worked, she began to hum. It was the old tune, the first one, the simple, nameless melody that had drifted out of a lonely kitchen window over a year ago. But the sound was different. It was no longer the thin, reedy whisper of a woman humming to herself in the dark. It was a low, clear, and steady sound, full of a quiet, unshakable confidence. It was the sound of a woman who knew her own song and was no longer afraid to sing it. As the notes filled the warm, quiet kitchen, the great stove gave a soft, contented crackle, the sound of settling embers, a low, rumbling harmony. Outside, the wind, which had been worrying at the corners of the building, seemed to pause. It held its breath for a single, still moment, a silent, listening beat, just as it had on the day a lone cowboy had reined in his horse to listen to a sound he didn't understand. Colt came to stand beside her behind the long counter. He didn't speak. He just leaned against the wood, his presence a solid, comforting warmth. Their shoulders brushed, a simple, easy contact. There was no need for grand promises, no need for vows spoken before a preacher. Their commitment was in the shared weight of the day's labor, in the easy rhythm of their life together, in the silent, perfect understanding that passed between them in a single, shared glance. All they needed to do was keep the fire lit, keep the food cooking, and keep the music playing. Their life was their promise. Sometimes, to find the person you are meant to be with, you don't need a loud voice or a grand plan. Sometimes, all it takes is the quiet courage to hum a small, simple song, true to your own heart. The rest, the wind will carry, and it will stop the right person, in the right place, to listen. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.